Well, my previous video on King Kong's real lost scene, not the spider pit sequence, blew up like completely unexpectedly. About 30,000 or so views, which is really good for me as of the time I'm taping this. Thank you so much to everyone who watched it, shared it, subscribed, and commented on the video. And comments on the video can be kind of divided into three general groupings. The first and largest are the people who enjoyed the video, who were really engaged with it, and who thanked me for it and added in their own comments and observations and thoughts about it. And thank you so much for that. There was a second, much smaller group, a handful of people, who were very upset that I didn't actually share the footage of this lost scene of Kong climbing Skull Mountain, which would have been difficult since it is a lost scene and doesn't exist. There was also a third group who were more interested in what I had to say about the spider pit sequence and the fact that I don't think the spider pit sequence was ever actually filmed to begin with, and disagreeing with me about that and wanting to fight me on that. And I thought, since enough people were engaged with that topic, that I would make a full video in response to that. I've talked about the spider pit sequence before in other videos and live streams and so on, but I'll do a whole video here just giving an overview of why I think the spider pit sequence was never filmed. What are the lines of evidence that lead me to think that? This is not by any means going to be a comprehensive overview of all of the evidence for the spider pit sequence. There are other videos that cover that. And the classic horror film board has a dedicated thread to the spider pit sequence. That's like 67, 68 pages, something like that. If you want to read the full story, the full comprehensive account of it. But I'm going to go over just sort of the key pieces of evidence that lead me to believe what I do about the spider pit sequence never being filmed. Now, the spider pit sequence, of course, is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, lost scene in cinema history. This scene, this legendary scene that people have been looking for 90 years, has the sailors being chased onto the log over the ravine. Kong knocks them off the log, knocks the log down into the ravine, and the surviving sailors are attacked by different insects and spiders and reptiles and lizards, all sorts of things, and killed in this horrible way. In the scene that Willis O'Brien was said to have thought was his finest piece of animation, that Merian C. Cooper was said to have taken out of the film because it was just too horrifying for audiences to stand. All of which really sounds like very legendary accounts. Right? It's a legendary scene with a lot of sort of myth built up around it, and a lot of wishful thinking around it. And that's what I find the most when I go look at the evidence for this scene, is a lot of reinterpretation and misinterpretation and willful thinking about what the people involved, Merian C. Cooper, Orville Goldner, Willis O'Brien, the people involved in the making of the film, what they actually said versus how authors and historians and so on interpret that of what they wish was true about this film. Now, my comments about it, my views about it, were based, what I had said was based primarily on what the film historian Ray Morton, a King Kong expert, King Kong author, wrote about it. He is saying that he had seen the shooting schedules for the film. Of course, a movie has a script that it's following to create the story, but they also create a logistical shooting schedule, so they know what scenes they're filming when. And in the shooting schedule, there's no mention of the spider pit sequence. But, as some pointed out in the comments, and referring back to what Bart Pierce has said in the classic horror film board, that the shooting schedules don't specify any animation. They just say, block animation here. They were working on animation. They don't say what scenes were being animated specifically. Therefore, they argue that you can't use the shooting schedules as evidence the spider pit sequence was never filmed. And fair enough. Okay. If we take Bart Pierce at his word that there's no specification of what animation was being done in the shooting schedules, I still don't think the spider pit sequence was ever made as a piece of finished animation that was put in the final film and then removed afterwards. So let's review the evidence. Now, first of all, there are reports by people who claim to have actually seen this in audiences, whether they saw it in the theater or they saw it in the test screenings in San Bernardino before the actual premiere of the film, or even saw it on television. There are some people who claim to have seen it on television. I think these accounts can, frankly, be dismissed out of hand. Um, there's no evidence from anybody involved in the making of the film that the spider pit sequence ever got that far. I don't think any paying audience ever actually saw this. I think this is more a matter of, impressionable minds, false memory, Mandela effect, Berenstain universe, whatever you want to call it. Memory is not always as reliable as we would like it to be, especially childhood memory. I myself have false memories from childhood that I've been able to track down how these memories are false. When I was a kid, I saw this animated movie about a pair of cats flying on a steam train through outer space. And I was absolutely certain that in this movie there was a scene where they went to an ice planet and there were all of these bodies buried in the ice. But as an adult, I went back and I watched this movie, Night on the Galactic Railroad, based on the just absolutely beautiful novel by Japanese author Kenji Miyazawa. And there was no scene of an ice planet with people buried in the ice. So I went to the steampunk email group that I was running at the time and asked, like, okay, what's the deal? Where did I get this false impression of this scene from? And somebody pointed out, oh, that's from a different movie called Galaxy Express 39, which is also about a steam train flying through outer space. Ah, my childhood mind had conflated these two scenes quite logically. They're both about steam trains flying through outer space. I also did it to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I was certain there was a scene in 20,000 Leagues where they went to Atlantis and there was all this like lava and stuff running through the ruins of Atlantis. And then when Disney released it on DVD in like 2004, 2005, I bought it and watched it and there was no Atlantis scene. So I went back to the email group and like, hey, what's up? Why do I have this other false memory now? And someone pointed out, oh, that's from the end credits of Splash. And sure enough, I watched Splash, and there it was, right in the end credits, exactly as I remembered it, just in a different movie. So, false memories exist. Mandela effect is just false memory that can come from impressionable minds, hearing about it, seeing photos, maybe famous monsters of filmland, whatever, and grafting that together into a false memory in your head. So, I think it's safe to say no paying audiences ever saw this scene, and in fact, nobody at the San Bernardino test audience saw it either, and it was taken out long before that, based on what the people involved with the making of the film actually said. Okay, so what evidence is there then? So we know that models were built. We have photos of the models. We have photos of the set. We have these test photos done by the animation team showing these different models, these lighting tests and things like that. And the models appear in other movies as well. Once King Kong was completed, the stop motion models went into the RKO prop department where they ended up popping up in other movies. For example, Bringing Up Baby, the Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn movie. Um, in the museum, mixed in with all the dinosaur skeletons are these models of dinosaurs. Those are the models from King Kong in that movie. In the Kay Kaiser movie, you'll find out there's a scene in a prop room where you see the dinosaurs from King Kong and a couple of the spiders from the spider pit sequence, the big hairy spider and kind of the cartoony looking bulbous spider, who also goes on to appear in the Black Scorpion as well. So we know the models were built. We have plenty of evidence of these models having been built. We have the test photos that were done, but keep in mind, these are not like professional publicity still photos that we have for other scenes in King Kong, even other lost scenes, like the publicity still with the Styracosaurus and the log in Kong, or the stills of Kong climbing Skull Mountain. These are crude, very blurry, test photos done by the animation team with their little brownie cameras or Leicas or whatever they were using, just to test things out, see how the models looked in the lighting and all that sort of stuff. We only have like a small handful of those, but they exist nonetheless. The question is, was anything ever actually filmed? Did they do any test animation? And this is where revisionists like myself and Ray Morton and so on are criticized for equivocation. That will say that Spider-Pit sequence wasn't filmed, but then we might agree that test footage was done. Well, no, when we're talking about the Spider-Pit sequence not being filmed, what we mean is a piece of finished animation that went into the final cut of the film and was then removed afterwards, whether after the San Bernardino test audience or after the movie's premiere. Um, that doesn't rule out test footage being shot. And it does seem to be solid evidence that a test reel was made that had the Spider-Pit sequence in there. And that evidence comes primarily from Orville Goldner and Merian C. Cooper himself. So, very early, before King Kong was even approved as a film, $10,000 went into producing a test reel of animation that Merian C. Cooper brought to New York to show to RKO executives to get the green light, to get the budget approved to make King Kong. Now, Orville Goldner was an assistant to Willis O'Brien, working in the animation department. He was one of the animators on King Kong, and he went on to literally write the book about how the movie was made. And in his book, he reports what the contents of this test reel was. Now, this test reel begins with the sailors being chased onto the log by the Arsinotherium. This tells us this is a very, very early part of the story development for King Kong. Because we know how that part of the script progressed, how that part of the story progressed. It began with the Arsinotherium model that was originally built for creation for the movie that Willis O'Brien was working on as of 1931. The Arsinotherium being a large prehistoric mammal with a pair of horns coming out of its head. That Arsinotherium model that was made for creation was the first one used chasing the sailors onto the log in this test footage. Then the Arsinotherium was switched out for a Triceratops chasing the sailors onto the log. That's what's in the novelization. The Lovelace 1932 novelization is Triceratops. Then the Triceratops was switched out for Styracosaurus, another horned dinosaur. And we know that because we have the publicity still of the Styracosaurus. That one of the most famous publicity stills for King Kong, a shot that was professionally done, used to advertise the movie. The Styracosaurus is still in there. So it was at the very latest stage of the story development where the Styracosaurus was taken out, and the sailors just go directly from being chased by the Brontosaurus to onto the log, taking out that extra dinosaur in the middle that wasn't even necessary. This is another example of King Kong being a really punchy, really fast-paced, really tightly composed movie with no extra bloat, no unnecessary scenes. Even something as small as an extra dinosaur chasing the sailors wasn't necessary. So that was taken out. The Styracosaurus model itself was then reused in Son of Kong. So having this in Ethereum chasing the sailors onto the log tells us that this is very early animation, very crude animation, maybe not necessarily in its quality, but in terms of this is an animation that was going into the finished film. This was a test reel being done, just get it out there to sell this idea to the producers, to sell it to the executives at RKO. So the Arsinotherium chases onto the log. Kong knocks the sailors off the log into the ravine. They get attacked by the spiders and lizards and all sorts of things. And then the scene ends with a spider crawling up the side of the ravine, crawling up the vine to threaten Driscoll. So not the two-armed, two-legged lizard there, the proto-skull crawler that's in the finished film. This is the spider crawling up the vine. So again, we have the spider pit sequence in this test reel bookended by two scenes that are not in the finished film, that were changed for the finished film. So that tells us that this test reel is not the animation that went into the film. Maybe bits and pieces were grafted into the final film, but I would have my doubts about that. It was after the test reel that the spider pit sequence was taken out. Depends how long the spider pit sequence is in the novelization, but Um, anyway, either way, this is when it was taken out. It's after the test reel. How do we know that? That's basically what Marion C. Cooper says. So for this now, we have to go to Steve Vertlieb, the film historian, and others who carried on a correspondence with Marion C. Cooper in the final years of his life. And Cooper told basically the same story over and over again about how after this test reel, he realized that the spider pit sequence stops the story. Um, because we don't need the spider pit sequence, right? What's the story at this point in the movie? As I've said before, Anne is kidnapped by Kong and Jack is chasing them down. That's the story at this point. So we don't need to see an extended scene of a bunch of nameless extras dying in this horrible way because the extras didn't have names, didn't have stories, didn't matter to the story. So them just falling to their deaths off the log is entirely sufficient for taking care of getting rid of all these extras that we didn't need kicking around. So that's when Cooper realized it, is after the test reel, before any of the proper filming was being done. It's just that this commentary of Cooper of when he realized that the scene should be taken out gets reinterpreted willfully, perhaps by people who want it to be true, that it was after the San Bernardino test audience or something like that who reacted so strongly to it, and it was too distracting for the audience, or too horrifying for the audience, or what have you. No, Cooper realized after the test reel that this scene should be taken out. It doesn't actually serve the proper story. And there's two more pieces of evidence that I think suggest that the spider pit sequence never went to finished animation. One is that Max Steiner never scored it. There's reports that he saw the spider pit sequence, so perhaps he saw that test reel as well when Cooper, approached Steiner, said, "Here's this movie I want you to do the score for. Here's a test reel, so you get an idea of what this movie's about." So he might have seen the test reel, but then when he got a print of the film to compose a score for, there was no spider pit sequence in it, and he didn't compose any music for it. Now, critics of the revisionist position will argue, that there's other important scenes in King Kong that have no music either. Kong fighting the meat eater, Kong, the climax on the Empire State Building. Steiner was brilliant enough to know when the music should die out, and the silence and just letting the sound effects do their thing creates a more powerful scene. So they argue maybe the same thing happened here, that he didn't score the spider pit sequence because he felt that silence was more powerful for that scene than any music he could add to it. I think that's sort of spheres within spheres, trying to come up with an alternate explanation for what is the most simple explanation, which is that there was nothing to score. Steiner never saw it, never said he saw it, and you know we can also read Cooper and Golder in such a way as the spider pit sequence is taken out by that point. Also, the lack of publicity stills for it. So we talked about the test photos before. The test photos we have for the spider pit sequence are not like professionally shot publicity stills like we have for other scenes in the movie. In fact, even other lost scenes in the movie. I mentioned the publicity still with the Styracosaurus in it. We have this evidence of very late stage. The professional photographers came in, captured these publicity stills that went out to advertise the movie, had the Styracosaurus in it. We have the publicity stills, dozens of publicity stills of Kong climbing Skull Mountain. We don't have that for the spider pit sequence. We just have a couple of these same blurry test photos done by the animation team. We also have a couple blurry photos of Kong jumping across the skyline of New York on his way to the Empire State Building. And we have like one blurry test photo of Kong falling from the Empire State Building, showing us why they didn't put that scene in the movie. Because the way they tried to process this all together, you could see the Empire State Building through the silhouette of Kong. It just didn't work, so they took that scene out. So we have this evidence, but we don't have this plethora of professional publicity stills of the spider pit sequence. We just have a couple of these blurry test photos done. So to me, that would suggest this part of the film was never actually made. That the spider pit sequence was never actually done through finished animation, and there was nothing for publicity, still photographers to shoot at that point. So even if we discount Ray Morton's commentary on the shooting schedule, I think the evidence is not strong enough, and there's enough counter evidence to suggest that the spider pit sequence was never made as a piece of finished animation. And the chance of finding the test reel is non-existent at this point. Like finding any of the lost scenes from King Kong, I think is the chance is zero on that. So, given that the evidence seems to be so poor for the spider pit sequence actually existing, once we disqualify all the wishful thinking and interpreting what people say in a certain way, um, and look at it through a lens of asking if the scene ever actually was made. The next question would be, why do we want it to have been made? Why do we want the spider pit sequence to exist? Why is there so much mythology about it? Why do we say this is, Willis O'Brien's best animation and the most horrifying scene in the movie? Why do we want it to be true? Why do we want it to be out there? And I think for that, the most obvious answer is the easiest one, which is that we love this movie. We love King Kong. It is one of the greatest movies of all time, one of the greatest movies from the greatest era of Hollywood history, the greatest adventure movie ever made, the template for all adventure movies to follow, providing just this incredible iconic imagery synonymous with Hollywood, synonymous with Hollywood's golden age. King Kong climbing the Empire State Building is as iconic as Dorothy and the gang skipping down the yellow brick road in Wizard of Oz, as Clark Gable not giving a damn in Gone with the Wind, as Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman in Casablanca, Bela Lugosi as Dracula, Boris Karloff as the Frankenstein monster. It's alive. It's one of those iconic things. Um, we love this movie and we want more of it to exist, right? We wish there was more of this movie, of this world that we're so engaged by to exist. That's what drives the creation of sequels and cinematic universes and that sort of thing. We want there to be more to the story, right? It pains us to think that this is all there is just like this one movie. We want there to be more of this thing that we love. But sadly, um, for the spider pit sequence, it just doesn't look like it ever even existed to begin with. Other lost scenes, like Kong climbing Skull Mountain, um, would have long since been lost to time, anyways. The film deteriorating or recycled for its chemicals or just lost or destroyed in some other way. The test reel, more likely than not, itself destroyed or recycled or what have you. These things just don't exist anymore. And therefore, we have to get that urge for more, we have to find other ways, right? By watching the movie over and over and over again, the sequel, the epilogue, Son of Kong, embracing that, reading the novelization where it does have all of those missing scenes in there, and of course the slower pace of reading lets us steep in that world, in that setting, more and more in that story. Collect the merch, get into it that way, and even adding our own creative endeavors to it. Um, if you want to see the spider pit sequence, Peter Jackson's recreation of it, filmed in 2005, is your only real bet to actually see a spider pit sequence. Recently, an animator posted his tribute to King Kong, showing what happened when Kong slammed into the streets of New York from atop the Empire State Building. What happened next, kind of thing. Which, let me tell you, I was not prepared to cry that day, but there we go. Or even if you're not creative with your hands in that way, even in your imagination, right? Visualizing the scenes in the novelization, having your own little pieces of headcanon, right? One of my favorite pieces of headcanon now is that there was a 1933 Scar King who was the king of Skull Island, and 1933 Kong defeated 1933 Scar King to become King Kong, king of Skull Island. That's part of my personal headcanon now. We can add to the film in these ways with our own creative endeavors, with our own imagination. Um, Go deeper into that world through collecting, through watching the films again and again, and in oblique ways like watching connected movies like Bird of Paradise and Most Dangerous Game and things like that, tracking down those models in other movies like You'll Find Out and so on, and getting deeper into it that way, because unfortunately, as sad as that is, as happy as I would be to be wrong, if it were to pop up tomorrow, I would have admit like, okay, I was wrong, spider pit sequence exists. I would love for the spider pit sequence to actually exist, but sadly, unfortunately, it just doesn't look like it was ever even filmed as a piece of finished animation to begin with.